Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the GENEDRIVE PLC full year results investor presentation. Throughout this recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time using the Q&A tab just situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Just simply type in your questions at any time and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. Before we begin, we'd like to submit the following poll, and your participation, I'm sure, will be greatly received by the company. And I'd like to hand over to CEO David Budd. Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mark. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Budd. I'm the Chief Executive of GENEDRIVE, and I'm joined today by Russ Shaw, our new Chief Financial Officer, who's just joined GENEDRIVE in March of this year. Thanks to all of you for joining us on this Monday to review the company's activities and progress during our fiscal year to June 2022. Presentation run about 25 to 30 minutes, I think, total. I'll take you through the company's product development and commercialization progress, at least those sections of the presentation, and Russ will take you through our finance slide, and we'll both participate as appropriate with any questions that you have towards the end. As usual with the Investor Meets Company platform, there have been some questions submitted in advance, so we had a little bit of an opportunity to take some of those and elaborate them on the within the slides themselves, so we can cover some of them there. As a company, we've been building and refining our development capabilities, but also putting a lot of time and effort behind our commercial capabilities as well, working with selected partners that have the ability to develop the market for our products. We'll highlight some of our progress and processes in today's overview. So slide 2, these are the normal disclaimers for company presentations, which you can read in your own time, of course. There's no need to try to capture slide images. The presentation itself will be posted onto the GENEDRIVE PLC website following the presentation today. So as many of you know, the company's foundation is the GENEDRIVE instrument platform with 2 different versions to serve different user needs. The original small handheld version and a slightly larger benchtop version are now available. The system is closed, meaning that users need to purchase pre-formulated test cartridges in order to run the system. And then the results are interpreted by a preloaded software algorithm. Either unit is operated by loading a patient sample into the cartridge and then inserting the cartridge into the front of the instrument, and then either pressing the start button or initiating a test from the new interactive touchscreen. After the test runtime is complete, clearly actionable results are displayed on the screen for the nurse or the clinician. Total analysis time can be as fast as 7.5 minutes. And it was with our antibiotic-induced hearing loss tests as well as our COVID-19 test that we really honed in on our development and assay capability to deliver genetic results much faster than other companies' systems. And that's really important as we think about the strategic focus of the company and how we can make a meaningful difference in specific markets, how we try to keep our differentiation over the long term, and of course, how we improve on patient outcomes. It's critically important that devices are able to be used in the environments in which they're intended. And it's maybe not something that's in forefront of your mind, but even running a simple test at the point of care is a new frontier, right? I should say a simple genetic test at the point of care is a new frontier. So instruments and tests and software need to be able to be used by people like nurses that have no previous molecular diagnostic experience. And certainly that's something that we can demonstrate quite easily now in our publications of our products. And we've even progressed that further with the introduction of our benchtop GENEDRIVE system. Again, this is really important for the strategic fit of the company as we are introducing genetic testing into new areas of the hospital that have not had the benefit or experience of molecular diagnostic testing on their wards previously. So I think it's fair to say that GENEDRIVE now has a solid track record of innovation in hardware, software, and test development. We were the first company to introduce a decentralized molecular test for HCV, hepatitis C. We were the very first to deliver our antibiotic-induced hearing loss test into the neonate environment, and we soon hope to be the first company with a point-of-care test for CYP2C19 that best fits with all of the newest clinical recommendations and guidelines for stroke management. And as I mentioned, with our patented technology, we refined our strategy to focus on emergency medicine, where genetic information can help improve urgent medical care if you're able to deliver a result quickly. So we're focusing on applications where getting results in under an hour is really meaningful. So broadly speaking, our development initiatives are focused on a market or an area that is known as pharmacogenomics. Now, pharmacogenomics is admittedly an emerging field in patient management, where knowledge of a person's DNA variation enables what's known as precision medicine, which means giving the right drug to the right people at the right time. Now, a key requirement here is to move the complex lab-based results closer to the prescribing physician and deliver these test results in an unambiguously clear format. And it's here that the GeneDrive point of care system promises real impact. So we believe there are really important advantages to this focus. Now, most competitive companies depend on a large menu of assays that can be run on their single instrument. And that's because their relatively high instrument cost demands a suite of tests to make it economical for the company and the customer to do any testing at all. Now, we're maintaining our focus on keeping instrumentation and chemistry manufacturing costs comparably low. And then we're able to focus on really interesting and impactful opportunities that are much more discrete in their nature. And it means we don't require extended user menu. These are applications that we hope to own today and are potentially less subject to future competitive pressure. Lastly, our ability to generate genetic results very rapidly compared to competitive systems and demonstrate the ability to implement in decentralized healthcare settings means that emergency medicine is an area where we are differentiated from others and we can impact on precision medicine approaches. Large potential markets exist where we can make both commercial progress and a real clinical difference. So here's an overview of some of our operational highlights for the fiscal year to current. As I think probably all of you know by now, the seminal JAMA Pediatrics paper on the PALO trial was published. This was the implementation for our MTRNR1 test within the NHS. This paper is the foundation we're working on to support the commercialization and implementation of the GeneDrive MTRNR1 test in the neonatal intensive care environment. We've covered this with you before, but as a result of our real world work with the PALO trial and the PALO team, we created and launched a new GeneDrive system, which was specifically created for the needs of an urgent critical care environment. We had our first system sales, system assay sales and system deployments, the GeneDrive system for RNR1, which happened at St. Mary's Women's Children's Hospital in Manchester. 2 other Northwest hospitals are now in the process of training and install, and I'll go into some more details on our commercial progress on the next slide, I think it is. We're very pleased to be included in 2 product review initiatives from the UK's National Institute of Clinical Excellence. One has now become an accelerated evaluation of the GeneDrive MTRNR1 test, and the other is, I guess, a standard evaluation for the use of CYP2C19 genotyping for managing stroke patients, or I guess probably for the administration of clopidogrel is exactly what it's for. Most of these programs serve to collect and publish the supporting evidence for the NHS and then provide recommendations for use of these tests going forward. Now, while not specifically connected, both the process of NICE reviews and national commissioning go hand in hand to allow sort of the standard broad commercialization of new products, at least in the UK. And by that, I mean that products are recommended, the funding is in place at a national level for hospital purchasing. Next, our point of care GeneDrive COVID-19 test received CTDA or coronavirus test device approval in May, albeit, as you know, this was after the wave of COVID testing was coming to its completion. And lastly, most recently, we filed with the US FDA our pre-submission for the GeneDrive MTR and R1 kit. Now, we had previously indicated that we would wait for sufficient funding to be in place in order to pay for the entire FDA process. But now we feel that we at least can make a start and have identified some partners in the USA who can support us to make the overall process more cost effective. Our FDA pre-sub is really just the first phase to get agreement from the FDA on the clinical and study approaches of our registration process, given the unique nature of the GeneDrive MTR and R1 product. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a discussion around the commercial activities that have been going on. So over the second half of the year, we did put a new commercial sales structure into place at the company. We recruited some new business development people and created a specific marketing communications team. Together, they've been very active, and I think that many of the people joining the call today would have seen the market impact and engagement of their outreach in places like mainstream newspapers and some of the specialized clinical publications and press. Primarily, the activities of the team have been around supporting the commercialization process of R&R1 within the UK, as well as broadening our footprint into Europe with new partners. So, I mean, we have so I guess stepped back and asked ourselves, some questions about why the distribution partners we've had historically haven't been very successful at selling, and the recognition that selling disruptive new products into new markets, actually is a different job than, selling perhaps an improved product into a market that's already established. So we now have quite an extensive sort of checklist, I guess, or list of requirements that we work through in order to onboard new commercial partners. And that's going to help us give some additional confidence that the partners can define, not only define a clear path to market, but they're actually able to put the plan and action into place and make it happen for us. So over on the right here, a little graphic there under commercial onboarding. We're currently working with 22 different distribution partners throughout the process. We've now contracted 2 partners, one of which is Inspiration Healthcare, and our newest partner, which is in Spain, which is a different company than the one that we contracted for COVID-19. We've got 3 partners at what we term the negotiation stage, which means that we're talking around the terms of the contract, but they've made it through the sort of checklist process. And we've got an additional 5 partners that have now been fully qualified through the checklist and which we're just beginning negotiation with. The checklist process is quite a rigorous, process. It requires the partner to do quite a lot of due diligence and market research, and really shows that they have the capabilities to take our products on board and drive market adoption for the GeneDrive MTR and R1 test. So in addition to those 10 partners that have been fully qualified, we have an additional 14 partners which are now at a pre-qualified stage. So these are partners that, again, we're having active discussions with. They look like the right people, but we're working through the checklist with them. We're having active conversations to see if they're going to be the right partners to develop the market for us. So overall, there's been a lot of, a lot that's happened over the last sort of 5 months, a lot of progress there, I think. Our commercial marketing team is engaged with funders, payers, influential bodies such as NICE. So they're responsible for supporting and kicking off and providing data and supporting documentation to the NICE reviews. And they've also done things like developed quite thorough health economic models, which we're using to support NHS trusts through their various business cases as they establish funding. And just a little bit more on the commercial marketing side. Again, I think most of you that are engaged with the story, GeneDrive story, would have seen, the dozens of articles and news highlights that appeared in the press, since sort of April timeframe. They're all have been in mainstream press, clinical press, etc. And all of the stuff actually is really critical in the market development work that we're doing to raise awareness of what our tests can do. So on the assays, first I'm going to take you through the progress for AIHL with the GENEDRIVE MTRNR1 test. So as I already mentioned, the PALO study was published in JAMA Pediatrics, and this was the culmination of 3 years of development planning, performance evaluation studies, further product development and product improvement. Much of that, which was actually during a difficult time during the COVID years. This was a really groundbreaking study demonstrating the first time that point of care genetic testing had ever been done in an acute care environment. In this case, specifically a neonatal intensive care environment. But to our knowledge, it's the first time that a genetic test was used in any, or a point of care genetic test was used in any acute care setting. So really sort of pivotal, groundbreaking study. The study itself tested 751 babies during the course of just under a year. And it demonstrated that our rapid test could be successfully implemented in this critical neonatal environment. It showed that neonates at risk of deafness could be identified, and that critically, physicians were able to alter their prescribing as needed without negatively affecting the patient's care pathway. So really, to be honest, it was everything you could have wanted in a pharmacogenomics paper, right? The journal reviewers themselves concluded that the study was an example of pharmacogenomics entering a new era, right? And so needless to say, there was a lot of excitement around the PALO publication. And it now serves as the documented basis on which we are building our commercialization activities. I think obviously during the trial, the trial itself identified 3 babies with the gene variant, and they were subsequently given alternative treatments, right? And as a result, those kids are leading, fundamentally different lives than they would have had in the absence of the work that we've done at GENEDRIVE. So it's something that we are all genuinely very, very proud of. So ototoxicity or deafness from antibiotics is widely known, but previously people couldn't really do much about it, right? With the emergency care requirement to administer antibiotics urgently, that overrode the side effects or the risks of using them. So coinciding with the completion of the PALO study were clinical guidelines released by an organization known as CPIC, and they advised clinicians that they should seek to understand a patient's genetic makeup prior to administering gentamicin. And that's one of the key things that helped kick off the NICE reviews for the GENEDRIVE MTRNR1 test. So it's clear that this is a really exciting opportunity for us. We're the only company with a commercial test, and to be fair, probably one of the very few companies with an instrument platform proven to be appropriate for use in this type of environment. Based on the rates that MTRNR1 is present in the population and national birth rates, we estimate the total global market opportunity to be worth in excess of £100 million. Now, it makes absolute sense that we first introduce this product into the UK and the NHS, as this is where the initial evidence is generated, and it's where the thought leaders on this topic are known, right? It's not the most transparent or easy place to launch a product because the NHS tends to very much operate as a single buyer. But I think we've done a really excellent job to get the critical factors for success moving. We have St. Mary's Hospital fully up and running. We've got 2 more in process. We've got a further 8 hospital clusters. So those are hospital groups now in the sales funnel. All of these, of course, are going to be subject to successful contracting to bring through. And this actually does align with our expectations, right? We recognize that today, this is a market development activity, and it's not just a simple selling activity, right? The NHS is not awash in cash, and we all know that. But if you have a positive health economic story, it does allow budgets to be put into place and purchasing to follow. Now, ultimately, for it to be a very sort of straightforward selling process, we would want to have a NICE recommendation. We would want national commissioning in place. We'd want to have a very positive health economic story, and we'd want reference sites using the product. And actually, 2 of the 4 of these are already in place, and the other 2 are in process. So the clinical interest is certainly encouraging, but in the absence of national commissioning, which means cash, trusts need to establish the funding themselves currently, right? The test is being introduced to a user group, a neonate laboratory, a neonate environment that didn't previously have to budget for this sort of thing in their department, right? So we've worked with independent health economic modelers to develop quite a comprehensive spreadsheet or analysis tool that can illustrate very effectively the net cost savings to a hospital or a hospital system, or in fact the NHS as a whole. And we're engaged with these various trusts that I mentioned to set up their own business cases and to get funding established. The screenshot that I got in there is just sort of the cover page of what it looks like, but it is a very in-depth and comprehensive study. Overall, it demonstrates the positive health economic model in using a GENEDRIVE test compared to the avoided costs of cochlear implants and many of the additional healthcare costs that can arise as a result of lifelong deafness. So I guess the summary is that we're making a lot of good progress, and actually we should feel positive about that, right? We wish the overall selling process was faster, but it's not a straightforward selling activity, right? It is a market development activity. Prior to the publication of PALO, many people were skeptical that this could even happen, and certainly unaware of the sort of innovation that we had at hand. We've put excellent processes and tools into place to support the market development activity. We've recruited focused and knowledgeable people that I'm very happy with, that are working to ensure that all of our distribution partners have the means and the capabilities to drive our innovation in their various markets and countries. So the next test that I'm going to cover is our CYP2C19 product, which is a product that we still have in development, but is also another acute care pharmacogenomic test. So I think it makes sort of sense to discuss that next. And it clearly demonstrates the opportunities and capabilities that we have in acute and urgent care environments, which, as I mentioned, really is an untapped market segment in our industry. So CYP2C19 is a gene which is involved in processing many drugs, right? I mean, we talk about clopidogrel, I guess, when we're talking about this, but actually it's involved with a lot of different drugs, right? Such as antidepressants, statins, all sorts of things. So in many ways, it's quite a commercially exciting marker because its potential uses are across a wide variety of clinical uses, of clinical indications. So in future, the hope is that we'll be able to expand the claim of the products into other areas, which wouldn't actually require much in terms of product modification at all, just the clinical justification of why your test can be used elsewhere. But in the case of ischemic strokes anyways, which is where clopidogrel comes in, that is the most widely prescribed drug alongside or prescribed in together with aspirin to prevent further instances of strokes or further blood clots after a patient has an initial incident. However, clopidogrel's effectiveness really depends on a person's CYP2C19 genetic makeup, right? Their ability to metabolize this drug, with up to 20% of patients actually not responding to clopidogrel at all, right? So it's clear that these are large markets, right? If we look at the UK last year, there were over 32 million antiplatelet items prescribed, and the NHS spent 78 million pounds on them. And our population is, I don't know exactly what it is, probably 7%. A single-digit fraction of the entire Western healthcare economy. So you can see that this is a huge market. The process of testing for CYP2C19 is actually very similar to AIHL from a user's standpoint, although the test formulation itself is quite complicated, and I've got a slide on that to show you. But for the user, it's effectively the same, right? It's a buccal swab of the mouth, resuspend that into the cartridge and into the machine. The vision for the product has a lot of parallels to antibiotic-induced hearing loss, right? A patient is admitted into hospital or into A&E, and they'll be able to get their genetic basis of their CYP2C19 metabolizer status known within an hour, right? Which gives clinicians every opportunity to safely then put them on clopidogrel, or importantly, if they're a non-metabolizer for clopidogrel, to put them on alternative drugs, right? Clearly getting patients on the correct treatment at the right time as soon as possible is a critical goal of precision medicine. I would say actually that the market itself is actually more developed than MTR-NR1. CYP2C19 has been around for a little while as a known clinical marker. And there are already existing guidelines on testing for clopidogrel and CYP2C19. And there have been in some areas other point of care devices available. But from our view, they're not very easy to use and they're actually not very rapid. So they're somewhat limited into the level in which they can play within precision medicine and the acute care environment. I mean, interestingly, if we look at the US, for example, there is already specific reimbursement established for CYP2C19 testing, which is $291 per test. So that's the price that an insurer or a patient or whatever would pay to have the test done, right? And if you just look at ischemic strokes, again, remember I mentioned that this test could be used beyond strokes, but if you just look at those, there's around 700,000 of those in the US alone every single year. So our inclusion, again, in a NICE review can only be seen as a very positive development to support the future launch of this product. So this is maybe slightly technical, but I don't think I've shown this to you before. So just to understand how it differs from AIHL. So unlike RNR1, where you're just looking actually for a single gene variant, here with CYP2C19, we're actually looking at 6 different variants. And each of these work alone or in concert to drive different metabolic statuses, or I should say metabolizer statuses, I guess is what you'd say. So if a patient has the common variant, which is shown like in green, they'll just be normal metabolizers or responders, right? But if they possess a variant in any of these things, like we've shown in red here, their ability to metabolize the drug is then compromised, right? With some not responding and some not responding at all. And the GENEDRIVE software on the system will interpret these signals and output the various clinical options in a very simple, straightforward way to the user. For patients that carry one of the variants of concern, as I mentioned, they're put on alternative treatment. Ticagrelor is the prime one that people go on to. There's an increased risk of bleeding with this drug, is where the literature sits today. But using this genotype guided approach, it avoids giving these patients clopidogrel, to whom it simply wouldn't work at all, right? So it's a great example of using genetics to guide the appropriate therapy for a patient at a very critical time of their life. We anticipate that the product will be released around the same price point, has around the same manufacturing costs as well for MTR-NR1, and the end user pricing might differ a little bit depending on the reimbursement rates by various countries. Our business development team is following up with our diligence process to establish commercial partners in various markets for this. They could be or could not be the same ones as RNR1. It really just depends on how they're set up in their various countries. The last slide I'm going to report out today is on our COVID-19 point of care test. And I think we know it doesn't come as much a surprise this morning when we reported that we haven't made any sort of significant commercial advancements on the test, since we can all see in hindsight that it was launched at a time when the rate of COVID testing was coming down quite dramatically, and the requirement for testing for things like travel was being eliminated. So a good thing for the world, of course, but not a great thing for diagnostic businesses trying to drive COVID uptake. And the reality is COVID testing has just not returned as of yet, right? None of us is out there really getting COVID tests done anymore. We have our distribution partners in place in the Middle East and Spain, who actually have been working very diligently to find opportunities, but they simply have not materialized simply because the epidemic hasn't really reemerged yet. And government testing policies haven't looked at reintroducing testing. So we do stand ready and poised for future opportunities should the testing demand return, but similar to you, we're not in a position to judge if and when that might happen. Okay, so I'm going to hand the discussion over to Russ to take you through our summary financials. I'll come back and go through our news flow, expected news sort of publications over the next 6 months, and then we'll go over into our Q&A session. So, Russ.
Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Russ Shaw, the Chief Financial Officer. I have just one slide summarising the financials for the year. As Dave has just explained earlier in the presentation, there was limited sales traction in the year. This was in no small part due to receiving our CTDA in May, which coincided with the lifting of the lockdown restrictions. Operating costs of 5.7 million reduced by 500,000, which reflects the continued tight cost management. This year's R&D tax credit is 1 million, which takes the loss after tax for the current year to 4.7 million. In terms of cash flow, the cash consumption from operations was 5.3 million, which is broadly in line with the previous year. Working capital consumed was 500,000 less than the prior year, which is consistent with the reduction in operating costs. And we received 1.2 million from HMRC regarding last year's R&D tax claim. There was a 6.7 million cash injection from the sale of shares, which included the placing and open offer of 6.6 million in October 21. And this gives us a net cash inflow of 2 million for the year, which when added to the 2.6 million brought forward, means we ended the year debt-free with 4.6 million of cash in the bank. And just to give an update on the post-year end cash position, as at the 31st of October, we had 3 million, which was in line with our current 400,000 per month burn rate. And that concludes the financial summary. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Russ. So last slide. Hopefully we're on time. This is the anticipated sort of news flow at a high level. So in the next 6 months, clearly we intend to be signing up and contracting additional distribution partners for MTRR1, right? It's obviously critical that we expand the footprint into Europe and begin market development activities there. We expect to have additional go-live sites in the UK for MTRR1. As I mentioned, 2 in process already, 8 clusters in the funnel. The consultation for RNR1 through NICE will be completed in less than the next 6 months, and expecting the output from that. We will continue the promotion and launch of the GENEDRIVE MTRR1 assay in the EU countries following signing up of distribution partners. And we will also be launching our CYP2C19 product in the UK under what's now known as the UK CA mark. So this is sort of a post-Brexit CE marking that is specific for the UK. So we'll see that we're targeting around the April timeframe. If I look on the longer than 6 months timeframe, the second NICE review, the one for clopidogrel and CYP2C19, will be completed in that timeframe. We'll be launching the CYP2C19 into other territories following what's now known as the IVDR registration. So we have UK CA mark now for the UK for this product, and then we have IVDR for Europe. So that's a different registration process now, and it will take a little bit longer, which is why it's slated for longer than 6 months. And then we have our initial pre-sub meeting with the FDA in December, and then pending those discussions, we'll know where we are in terms of what the trial work looks like going forward. So hopefully we'll be able to say something positively there. Okay, so that's where we're sitting in terms of news flow. That brings us to the end of the sort of the formal presentation. And thanks very much, Mark. And I guess we'll hand it over to Q&A.
That's great, David. Thank you very much indeed for updating investors this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions, but just while the company take a few moments to review those questions submitted already, I'd like to remind you the recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, will be accessible via your investor dashboard. I'd also like to submit that poll that I inadvertently didn't send to you earlier, so if you would give that your kind attention, I'm sure that the company would be most grateful. David, as you can see, and Russ, you can see you've had a number of questions from investors today. You also received a number of pre-submitted questions. So if I may, David, just hand back to you, and if I could ask you to read out those questions and give a response where it's appropriate to do so, I'll pick up from you at the end.
Sure, great. Thanks very much, Mark. What I'll probably try to do is try to group some of the questions into themes, I guess. Lots of the questions do come in actually before the results even get published or before the presentation is given. So we do try to sort of answer a lot of those things in the presentation itself. So hopefully now that we've been through that, some of the initial queries have been answered. But there's a few here that we can go into a bit more detail. So the first one is, following the huge leap forward in product development and approvals over the past 12 months, is it feasible or planned to license out certain products for a fee and royalty to allow GENEDRIVE to concentrate on what you do best, developing innovative new products? So I mean, the question really is around, revenue and how we're driving revenue. We tried to cover some of that in the presentation. I would say that from a licensing standpoint, this is effectively what you do when you enroll distributors, right? You're giving up a part of your potential margin to another company to pay for their activities of selling, and then you don't bear the cost of a national or global sales force. We don't sell directly to users. We work through distributors to reach end user customers, and the reason is that if they're selected well, they should know the end customers in terms of who they are, what their influences are, etc., and they're able to manage the sales process. Then we would be, say, based in Manchester, trying to manage a customer in Italy, for example. So the challenge is that, and I have said this before, that no one will ever, care about or be as passionate about your products as you are, and that's why it's important that we work side by side and sort of hand in hand with distributors. So we do have a commercial sales team, and their job is to work out in the field with distributors to make sure that they're making the sales calls, that they're able to handle objections and do the things necessary to get the sales process going. I guess in the future, licensing is something that would be possible, but at this stage, this is a market development activity, and I think we need to get through that stage through that stage first. The second question, Mark, that I'll tackle, I guess, is about fundraising. We mentioned fundraising in the RNS releases this morning, and lots of questions on the panel here on the right about fundraising. So it says it's clear that GENEDRIVE will need access to additional funding to remain a going concern ahead of expansion and sales linked to AIHL and stroke. Existing shareholders would like some clarity on further dilution that would come from an equity issue. Are there alternative sources of loan or debt finance that can be accessed to finance growth plans until the company is sufficiently cash generative to fund its own growth, removing the need for another round of equity? So we touched on it a little bit, especially in the going concern section. But maybe Russ, do you just want to pick up on that one if you could?
Yeah, sure. I think it's fair to say as a board we do continually assess the company's future funding requirements and the cash runway. That's all been set out quite clearly in the annual reports and accounts. I don't think it would be appropriate to sort of comment on any specific financing activity, but we do have the options of reducing our expenditure to extend the cash runway, We're looking at alternative non-dilutive financing options. We have grant applications in process as well.
Okay. Next question is around the commercialization process for MTRNR1 in Europe. It appears to be taking longer than you would have hoped. Why is this? And what can be done to accelerate sales growth in the UK what can be done to accelerate sales growth in the UK and access the core European markets? Okay, sorry, apologies. The wording was a bit off there. Was obviously the point in the question is why aren't you selling faster, right? Internally, we always understood that there was initial sort of phases of this, right? It was about selling into Manchester. It was about selling into key opinion leaders, working on national commissioning before broad adoption could happen. So our initial ambitions were always somewhat modest in terms of numbers of customers that we would be able to get in this first phase, right? We knew that there was a requirement to let the market know about our products, to work with them to get funding into place on a case-by-case basis. And that's what we're doing before any sort of national pot of money can be available, right? So we're cognizant that initially it really wasn't a key opinion leader market at first. I think also in the point, could we have gotten into European markets faster? The answer is probably yes. We have the same sort of process to go through in most countries, right? In terms of market development and market education. So I think right now the issue is that we're putting a lot of diligence into making sure we get the right partners. But part of that is them doing that market assessment now before we sign them up, right? I think we found ourselves in the position before where we had distributors in some cases that weren't able to drive the market because they realized afterwards that actually it was more complicated and they weren't prepared to put the resources into place to make it happen. And we don't want to find ourselves in that position as well. So I did in the presentation take you through sort of the various stages and the numbers of countries and distributors that we're working with. And I actually think it's time well spent to make sure that we get the right people that can do the job for us, right? Distributors will want exclusive contracts in countries. And if you sign a contract and then they turn out to be not the right people, you can be a little bit stuck. So it's really critical that we focus on getting the right people in place in the various European countries that we're focused on. Next question, could you expand on the reasons for the timing for the pre-submission to the FDA for MTRNR1? How long do you expect to take for the FDA to make a decision on the pre-submission? And then what are the next steps and expected timeline for these, assuming the pre-submission is successful? Okay, so just so everyone's clear, we filed for a pre-submission or pre-sub as it's called, which is an initial meeting with the FDA to get their view on our product, right, and our plans for the FDA process. So we filed a dossier with them, and we have our first meeting with them in the middle of December. So it's an estimated 8-week time frame from the time you originally submit. And then what happens after that is really dependent on what the FDA has to say, to be honest. Most of the time, you go through a process which is called a 510K. And a 510K is a process of showing that your product is what they call substantially equivalent. So basically similar to another product that's on the market, right? So if you're introducing a product that's faster or more sensitive or something like that, you'll go through a 510K process. And one of the advantages of that is that you can just look at that other company's FDA filings and what they did in order to get approval and essentially replicate that. In the case of MTRNR1, there isn't a replicate product. There are other point of care tests in the market. There are other molecular tests in the market, but there isn't really a product exactly the same as us. So there is nothing that we can look at already in advance of chatting with the FDA to say this is what we need to do. So we put our proposals forward, and the pre-sub is about them trying to get some agreement with the FDA in advance of what studies it is that we're doing. So we really need to have this meeting and then get their feedback. And then that will drive the number of studies that are needed to be done, whether patients need to be enrolled or not, how many sites we need to do evaluations at. That drives the cost calculation, and it drives the time, right? So that's where we are right now. So because the question is what happens with the timeline for the pre-sub? I suspect we'll get feedback from the FDA in January or early February, would be my guess. And then we'll be in a position to figure out what it looks like going forward. Next question is around interest rates, global inflation, all that sort of stuff. How has GeneDrive been impacted by the recent rises in global inflation and interest rates? Russ, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Well, we're debt-free and we've got cash reserves, so we've benefited to some extent from the higher interest rates. Our energy costs are fixed until around the end of Q1 of 2023, so that gives us a good level of protection so far to date. Sales price is denominated in sterling, which potentially is more attractive for international opportunities. So yeah, overall, I think we've mitigated the impact rather well.
Okay. Russ, the next question is also a slightly finance-oriented question. How much further investment does the company expect to make in the CYP2C19 test?
Okay. Well, we've made excellent progress in the product development. And although there's increased complexity of the CYP2C19 assay, we have benefited from applying the lessons learned from previous developments, particularly RNR1, and the evolution of the GeneDrive instrument itself. I'd estimate that kind of 90% of the test development process follows a well-trodden path for us, and that includes the development of the test reagents, the cartridge, creating the software, and then once all those things are fixed, it's the process of driving those changes through the documentation. So the instructions for use, training, materials, etc. So alongside, there is some element that would be unique for each test, and that what drives kind of the variable element of it. So, you know, if there's a new technical issue or the level of patient customer data that might need to be generated. So, you know, in the main, I think a test takes 12 to 18 months to develop and has an average R&D expenditure of around 125,000 per month. And then the sort of the real variable depends on the cost of getting it to market and, you know, the clinical trials, whether that be sort of FDA or IVDR.
Okay, thanks, Russ. There's a question here on the panel from Jason. Why are you waiting for NICE to conclude before going to Europe? We're not. NICE is a UK-oriented organization. Globally, lots of countries do look at what NICE has to say, but we're not. From a UK perspective, we'd like to have NICE. We'd like to have reimbursement in place. But that's not obviously relevant for other European countries. So we're not waiting. Our work is really around the diligence that we're putting in selecting partners. So I mentioned in the deck, we've got two partners contracted now, another 3 quite imminent. So we will have 5 in a very short time frame, and those other ones are European based. There's a question from Miles. When thinking about ER, I guess emergency room, when thinking about ER acute testing, and on the back of CYP2C19, how many more similar diagnostic assays might you be able to work on, assuming cash was not an issue? So I guess, Miles, where we sort of get our initial list of tentative targets is the CPIC. If you go online and type in CPIC pharmacogenomics, for example, this is the clinical advisory board that tells patients or tells clinicians about how to manage patients with using genetic information. And there's quite a long list of potential targets there. So there's a few things that we think about when we want to bring a target on board. One is there a need to do it in the point of care? Is there a need to do it in an emergency setting? Is time relevant? how complex is it? Some genetic tests are very complex and would exceed the capabilities, for example, of a GeneDrive device. So all of those things we factor in, and the reasons that we're working on RNR1 and CYP2C19 is that they're high up on that list. So a lot of the clinical rationale already exists. But in terms of how many, we generally run the business to run 2 development activities at a time, recognizing that once a product is out the door, it doesn't mean it's done. So our R&D team, for example, still works on AIHL, right? We have, we do product modifications, we do updates on software, all of that sort of stuff, which does occupy some bandwidth of the R&D team. So typically we're running 2 assays at a time. And as Russ mentioned, on average, it's around $125K a month per assay, which is R&D expenditure. And so that's clearly something that we're able to flex if we want to. Next question, Mark. I'll do maybe 2 more, just cognizant of the time. Next question is some of the social media activity around the company can feel quite toxic. Does the company take action against abusive, vexatious, or potentially defamatory social media posts or emails which may direct to coming? The answer is no, really, to be honest. Like it's a free world, and people can say whatever they like, right? Provided that it's not illegal. It's just the world that we live in. Genuine investors can ask genuine questions, and our primary route that we use is via Walbrook, right? So you put questions through there, and we speak to them very often in terms of trying to get answers back to people. On the social media side, I guess we don't really engage in social media that's anonymous, right? So places like Twitter, forums, things like that, where you could be anyone, we don't participate in. Other than Twitter, we use as an outgoing channel, but we don't follow up on posts there at all. And I guess it's obvious to say, but if someone was a genuine investor and wants to see positive share price appreciation, they're not going to be online, being abusive, right? That these people are not investors, so we just tend to ignore them. The only place that we do any sort of active, I guess, social media management is just our LinkedIn page, because for me that's our sort of shop front on the world. We don't use it for financial or investor purposes, and so we do manage things a little bit there. And then I guess, Mark, the last question will be how long after the successful completion of the NICE DAP evaluation for our MTRNR1 test should we expect widespread NHS take up? So I did cover it a little bit, but just to, I guess, be clear about what's in our abilities. Today we are driving uptake and we are driving sales activities in trust, but we're doing it at a trust by trust basis. So we're focusing on what we call hospital clusters, so groups of hospitals, and we're working through the health economic model and working with them to put budgets into place so that they can purchase. That's what's in our control right now. Ultimately, we would love to have a NICE approval. Clearly, that's very beneficial, and we can work on that, right? We are supplying data, evidence, all that sort of stuff into the NICE review to best support the products the best that we can. We have references and clinicians that speak on our behalf as reference sites, so that's certainly very positive. The one thing that we don't have direct control as a company, because it's not really possible, is national commissioning. So we know, or we're told, that national commissioning is ongoing, but it's not a process that we are engaged in or influencing, really. And so we sort of have to let that, well, not let it go, it's not the right word, but it's less in our control. But ultimately, when that hits in place, that will drive the timeline that you ask about. So I think the NICE review in itself helps on the case-by-case trust discussion, but it is national commissioning once it's put into place, which makes buying of the product, at least in the NHS and in the UK, more of a routine activity.
That's great, David. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all of the investors that have submitted questions throughout today's meeting. We just simply haven't had time, given the number of investors on today's calls, to get through all of them. But David, I'll make all the questions available. If there's anything that we have missed or whatever, then obviously we can publish those when the meeting has concluded. I'll shortly redirect investors on the call to provide you with their feedback, David, which I know is particularly important to you and the company. But before doing so, I wondered if I may just ask you for a few closing comments. And then, as I say, I'll redirect investors for their feedback.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate your stewardship of the presentation today. We recognize the investor sentiment that we're good on developing products and haven't done a great job in commercializing, and we do take the comment on board. And we've spent a lot of effort over the time since the launch of MTR1 to get good commercial traction, and I do feel that we're making good progress. We are keen to hear from you, and if you have ideas or suggestions, again, you can use the normal channels to communicate with us, and happy to discuss with you further. Okay.
That's great. David, Russ, thank you very much indeed for updating investors this afternoon. Can I please ask investors on the call not to close this session, as we'll now automatically redirect you for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the company can better understand your views and expectations. This will only take a few moments to complete, but I'm sure will be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team at GeneDrive, we'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation. Good afternoon.